Hello everyone, today we talk about the Merovingian imperial ideology in the age of Clovis. As you know, we talked often about Frankish history, especially in this very delicate moment of the 6th century, in which, in fact, the same Frankish power and Merovingian dynasty were defined as the greatest power in Western Europe, and developing certain characteristics from a strictly political institutional point of view that would remain at the base of the developments of even the later Carolingian Empire, eventually the Kingdom of France, the Holy Roman Empire, and many other powers that fundamentally were organized from the models that had been created at this point in history. I mean, it's a very tortuous path to follow. It was definitely non-linear. I don't want to sound as if there was a direct correspondence between the Frankish kingdom and, I don't know, the later French monarchy, and so on. But it's definitely important to assess, however, the very heavy legacy existing, but especially the ideological origins in the of later Western imperial developments into the Merovingian political ideology, political theory, and practice. As you know, we also made a video specifically about Clovis that should be titled something like From Germany to Empire, Clovis, whatever, something about that. I created a medieval, a Frankish history playlist for that, so if you want, you can look at those videos as an introduction, generally speaking. But today we talk about something more strictly symbolical, right? That naturally has to do with Clovis, but not exclusively with his figure, right? Maybe on another occasion we will discuss the conversion proper, right? The let's say the Frankish, the Clovis conversion, the relation with Martin of Tours. And in, of course, if from a spiritual point of view, the let's say Catholic versus Arian foundation of the Frankish kingdom with the Battle of Vouillé, the idea of the marriage between the Merovingian leadership and the Gallo-Roman senatorial elites against the Arian bloc represented by the Visigoths in southern Europe, etc. That's quite important. We also discussed that some time. You can look into the Migration Era playlist that deals with that, incidentally. And these topics are particularly important, in my opinion, because aside from the story of the monarchs that arrive here, conquered there, and this year and that year, nobody actually addresses the truly essential spiritual legacies of such, the cultural, ideological basis of such powers, and what fundamentally defined them. Otherwise, you can't think basically the Frankish kingdom was the same thing like the Visigothic one or the Anglo-Saxon one, or well, it was yet to come, of course. But you know, you don't see any differences. There is objectively a lot to know about the Franks. The more I read about them, the more I kind of deepen their perspective, the more I remain amazed by what they managed to do, or better, what the Merovingians and Clovis fundamentally managed to do at this time. Here we don't even talk about the Franks anymore. Here we talk exclusively about the Merovingians, because that's what it had become, right? This is not a people, this is a dynasty, and this is the crucial element of the story. Here, a new dynastic theology, right, is being formed. This is a sacral monarchy. It has, as we will see, a divine mandate, and it has surpassed by far the tribal egalitarian character of the Germanic people in this strictly political institutional system. So naturally, looking at what this occurred like is not so easy. We have to interpret naturally what is told to us from sources such as Gregory of Tours, principally about life of Clovis, that in the Gallo-Roman author's work is essentially the figure of the new Constantine. Right now, we will insist a lot on this point because it's really the key for understanding this transformation. Gregory of Tours was born like 20 years after Clovis' death. So it's looking at the past, and in his work, Gregory fundamentally criticizes the current situation and Clovis' successors, because now the kingdom was already showing this moment of crisis, fundamentally, that derived from the fact that the Franks split their own domains at every single generation, so engulfing the monarchy in this constant struggle that basically by the end of the 7th century would have de facto nullified the kingdom as such, like there were 4 separate kingdoms and always quarreling with each other. Yet still, this is more meaningful because it's still the story, as we were saying, of a dynasty, right? It's not the story of several blocks of the Frankish people. It's the story of several courts, of several families that all stem from the Merovingian bloodline, and that embody itself with an acquired authority deriving from this bloodline that is really at the base of power. I mean, basically, not even the Carolingians will abandon the reverence towards the Merovingians, initially speaking. It will take the Pope for letting the Carolingians substituting the Merovingians on the throne, officially speaking, even de facto was already so. Because what Clovis had set in the 6th century objectively had been so powerful, so deeply rooted, and so functional, even for the sake of the various aristocracies to cooperate at this higher level with the monarchy, and making, therefore, having a greater control themselves and the rest of the population, is really what Francia had become, right? And it's the history of elites, right? Gaul is the history of elites. When the Franks arrive in Gaul, it's basically the Gallo-Roman elites that say, okay, now we have to, you basically have to do what we say. Like, you can't rule in here if you don't agree with our direction, if you don't embrace our political models, if you don't embrace our religion, right? And it was impossible for the Franks to rule Gaul as a unitary element without this compromise, and especially it would have been impossible for the Franks themselves to have a monarchy if this Gallo-Roman support had not existed, because the Franks were among this Western Germanic people some of the least centralized. You know, there was not really a Frankish monarchy. The Frankish monarchy is born where Clovis rises to power, beheading the rest of the Frankish nobility in an outrageous way for what the same Frankish political tradition and cultural customs had been about, that were relatively egalitarian, based on the concept of the Franks, of the freemen, right? And marries the Gallo-Roman senatorial or episcopal elites by essentially delivering, like rendering, defending them, militarily speaking, getting rid of other political entities that at that point would have created problems because they were Arian substantially, as the Goths were, and consolidating a power in this northern central Gallic area that will become, in fact, a sort of imperial power because of the amount of wealth and resources that were locally available, right? This system will progressively crumble, as we'll see during the 6th and the 7th century, right? But still, the system will remain ideally in place, right? And the Carolingians will essentially rebuild partly it. Under the Carolingians, something different happens somehow, but the monarchical base are the same, and obviously that is so because wouldn't like to govern as not really an absolute monarch, but really in a condition of power that grants governability. That was basically the major problem throughout all Latin Germanic Europe and beyond, right? So what the Franks had accomplished at this point was remarkable and allowed them largely to build further upon it, really capitalizing upon it and taking a step forward towards the full imperial direction. So when we read Gregory of Tours, we're basically reading the history of an idea of Clovis, that is the history of an ideal monarch, right? Fully Christian, fully just, intelligent, scrupulous, and a model, right? A model that is not just a model of government, is a political and, if you want, religious model at the same time. And Gregory had in mind Constantine, of course, right? Constantine was not a figure like the others in this context. Constantine was the prototype of the perfect emperor, right? Here it has nothing to do with historical reliability. Here it has to do with the meaning and the historical meaning that this had. Here we do not discuss whether whoever was good or bad. Here we discuss the fact that by the 6th century in Gaul, the most perfect absolute emperor had been Constantine. And because, of course, of the alleged Christianization as such, the fact that had legalized the Christian cult, hadn't really been himself first, but it came to be under him, and had obviously reshaped the empire in a form and in a manner that fundamentally would have a future lasting for another millennium. And aside from this, these are digressions, but the important is that now Gregory is a Frankish subject, right? We don't. I couldn't fully tell you how he saw this. Like the Franks were basically identified as protectors of Gaul, right? Gregory was lamenting this fact. Waves of barbarians had arrived and passed and destroyed, and the 5th century objectively had been pretty messed up, even though Gaul didn't really undergo massive destructions or structural reshaping of society and politics. This local Gallo-Roman elites had remained standing, but the Franks had finally come to give a more rational direction to this all, engaging the same local elites into government, and the elites had naturally supported this monarch in exchange for Christianization, this the construction of this very stable institutional system that naturally was monarchically oriented in its direction. And Gregory's message is actually very clear, right? Clovis' conversion is presented in a very classical fashion. It gravitates fundamentally around 3 major ideological poles. The first one is the one of the strong God, Lord of battles and dispenser of victory, that is characteristically Old Testamentary. The second is the proto-Christian one, and spread in Gaul in the celebration of saints and their relics with their relative thaumaturgic power. Third, the Constantinian one, of the sacral alliance between the monarchy and the church, right? This triad is fundamental. From one side, you see a very, very practical, very pragmatic, very material sometimes, political logic that derives from the sword, right? This had been the migration era. Lots of things that happened, as we just said. Many peoples had crossed, others had invaded, had been destructions, wars, bloodsheds, and so on. So now God comes to avenge this, to finally bring an equilibrium, a balance, right, for the chosen people of the Christians' route. But this is a strongly also veterotestamentary model, as we have seen. The model of a god that intervenes as Lord of Battles, right? Clovis had converted to Christianity, not like Constantine, that had seen, the cross before the battle, and therefore of the Milvian Bridge, and had ordered his legionnaires to paint it on their shields, and then everything had gone well because there was a conscience. The Clovis conversion is much more tormented in many ways, because it occurred, there had been already some predisposition, right, in Clovis' soul and conscience, of course, because of the miracles of Saint Martin of Tours and all, but he wasn't quite convinced. It was still pagan. Franks were pagans. They were fundamentally had this shared paganism based on this magical, naturalistic view of the world that was shared by everybody, like by the Alemanni, the Anglo-Saxons, whatever, in West Germanic peoples. And yet some of them had been already exposed to Christianity, right? Clovis' father was already, very faithful and sound and steady commander of Rome, had seen Roman Gaul, had served the imperial military, like many Germans had been doing since centuries at this point, and really appreciating already the advantages of Romanization, etc. Clovis' sister was an Arian. She had converted to Arianism. If I'm not wrong, she went, as it was normal at that point, in marriage with a god. So hence she had to be Arian because of the sake of marriage policy. But this all speaks to us of course, of a paganism that, as we will see today, was still the largest belief around there. These peoples were largely pagan, right? And Christianization was a political measure, political instrument to basically being more acceptable within the Roman Commonwealth, we can say at this point, in the international arena, right? But still, paganism entailed more than that. It was fundamentally sticking to that kind of primitive Germanic culture and environment of Central Europe, of the forest, etc., while Christianity now was fitting for a more developed society like the Gallo-Roman one. It was heavily Romanized, it was developed, it was urbanized, it was rich, right, very rich, and had supported these elites, and it was a civilization on its own. Now Gaul, remember, is kind of a thing on its own at this point. It's become even more important than Italy as such, in terms of wealth, of overall development, etc. So the Franks had been living in between these two models, these two worlds, and it was a big deal what Clovis did, exactly because of the choice that is a fully coherent one of passage from the other side, right? His mother was Thuringian, for example, that was from the hardest kind of Germanic stock. From a political point of view, we can presume the Franks themselves will, as Christians, will eventually even invade and destroy Thuringia. Well, not much because they were Christians. Actually, they did it together with the Saxons at the same time, but it's not a big deal. But let's say these Central European peoples at one point would come to fear what the Franks managed to build in Gaul, in a kind of a Christian, Roman, and imperial fashion that was completely alien to the Germanic, Central European, tribalistic, pagan world, right? And at the point that those Central European peoples, especially when the Ostrogoths were wiped out from Italy, will more preferably look at the same Roman Empire, right? Because more far away than the Franks for protection, because the Franks just wanted to swallow them, as it would happen, frankly. So, frankly, not a anecdotal adverb. So, the problem here is understanding that Gaul also in itself wasn't quite. It wasn't all Romanized, all fully Christianized, etc. It was still a world that. Gaul, first of all, had been one of the greatest successes of Romanization. Right, these peoples had basically embraced fully, with harsh or lighter means, let's say, Romanization. Same, France today speaks a Neo-Latin language. It was a very big world, a very large world that, in this sense, supported Romanization also because it had the base to basically make it root, right, to sustain it. Differently from other places like Germany and most of Britain, for example, that always remained. But certain areas of Gaul also had maintained their own prerogatives. Regions like Armorica, for example, had always been detached. Basically, not even the Franks at this point will venture in there because there wasn't much to, frankly, to gain from it. And yet there was also this kind of substratum of militarism that had been important because Gaul at one point became a very militarized region, very militarized province, because of the very strategic importance it had on the Rhine frontier to hold all of these peoples that had come from the other side. At one point, as you know, at the beginning of the 5th century, this this barrier fails. All these peoples pour in. Tactically, the Franks were already kind of settled into the Roman Empire in order to stem these populations came from the east. But while basically they're defeated themselves in this avalanche of Alani and Visigoths and Vandals, Burgundians pour in. Actually, no, there weren't Visigoths. The Visigoths had passed, completely cross off the Visigoths. The Visigoths had arrived in Gaul, yes, but not on that occasion. They would have come from the south, from Italy actually, and they would settle in Aquitaine, then eventually expanding into Spain. But the point I'm saying here is that Gaul had seen a lot going on, right? Before the Frankish stabilization as a monarchy, as a kingdom, a lot of things were still very fluid, right? There were many peoples that also challenged the same Frankish existence in there. Think about the Alemanni, right? Where at the Battle of Tolbiac, they're defeated by Clovis, and it's incidentally the same battle in which Clovis gets converted, right? There were the Burgundians, were the Visigoths in Aquitaine, that incidentally also was, especially in the south, one of the most intensely Romanized areas in the world. Was most intensely urbanized, Romanized, wealthy, right? And so there had been this sense of the incumbent resolution that was necessary, right? There was when there is all this political instability, things do not go well, because things can always escalate. At one point, you don't know what was gonna go like. So Clovis had brought order by the sword, right? And the Clovis conversion had occurred because he had called upon Christian God for defeating the enemy, right, in exchange for conversion. So this is interesting because even in sources like Gregory of Tours that naturally were fully Christian, these authors were realizing the fact that Clovis was enacting their typically pagan contractualistic deal, right? It was about I become Christian, but you give me victory, right? And it wasn't even a challenge to God. It wasn't just like saying, well, you were right, now help me, right? I will become Christian. No, it was saying, now that having seen San Martin of Tours miracles, Clovis had remained impressed, but was still, undecided and kind of skeptical about Christian, about Christian religion, the Christian divinity, and especially considering that he was a German, he was a warrior, he was a chieftain, right? And Christianity is something else. Christianity now with the empire had naturally fully embraced the idea that there is a state, that there is a military, that all have to work and fight for Christianity, but still the fundamental ethics is a peaceful one. It's not a pacifistic one. Never commit mistake to think that Christianity is as a pacifistic movement. Pacifists, there is no Christian pacifism by any. Christian is peaceful. It's not pacifist. No, let's not make this mistake. No pacifist can be a Christian fundamentally. The concept here is that it was a completely different referential point. It was a completely different social model that Christianity had entailed, right, as a religion, as a set of hierarchies, right. It was not about the military glory or the freedom of a people that had to rule over others for the sake of honor, of military prowess. It was about creating a society with an order, with an equilibrium, with a pious intent, right? And here the Christian, even military ideology was slightly evolving. I made some videos about that. It's not easy to. You can look at medieval Christianity playlist, but let's say that the idea, for example, of the enemy of the faith was yet to develop with more clearly, but it had to be better defined. For example, the migration era had already triggered a sense of a need for defense and security that Clovis now was coming to comfort, right? With his action as a Christian lord, but everything had started in blood, had been born and earned in blood. Tolbiac was a massacre. The Alemanni were destroyed. It was a god had won a people in blood, right? And this is very, very meaningful. And this naturally was seen in a redemption fashion, in a redemptive fashion. Wherever blood is involved, it's not just a punishment; it's a redemption of a people. It's the sufferance, it's the necessity of violence and of sufferance to occur into this world in order for something greater to happen. Right, just like Christ's passion had been. Right, the sacrifice also the Franks had made into this extremely difficult moment of the battle in which the Alemanni were about to win. Instead, Clovis votes himself to the Christian god and says, if you let me win, I will convert to Christianity. My people will convert to Christianity. This thing of the people is also very important because, as we've said before, Clovis reversed completely what the Germanic political culture was. No other Romano-Germanic king or people in practice would ever achieve what the Franks did. Like the Franks, the Merovingians did proper in Clovis. It was a complete, we could say, almost a revolution if it wasn't just a bad term in general. In fact, even this idea has been criticized, and that's why before I was stressing, for example, the acquaintance, the importance of the acquaintance that the Franks had with Christianity before Clovis' conversion in general, which is no surprise really, because all these Germanic peoples that had lived at the boundaries of Rome were obviously perfectly aware of what they were exposed absolutely to all of these several religions, not just Christianity, but the mysteric cults. They were already getting acquainted with something greater that they were perceiving as being greater. Always remember that the empire at this point is Christian. So the Germans, as we always said, weren't just thinking, like, we are Germans here, out there is nobody else, like, yeah, there are those Romans, we don't like them. The Germans were completely and exclusively and totally all about the empire. Like, they were obsessed with the Roman Empire themselves, because they weren't like the Huns or other nomadic populations just came there to raid and pillage or whatever. Just as, fortune was with them. The Germans had to deal with the Romans, and throughout time they had perfectly understood what that empire was about. And as pagans, just like the Romans had been, and don't think that even at this time that the difference is so sharp, even within the same formally Christian society, that they were obsessed about the fact of the Christian day. Like, these guys are Christian now at this point, and yet they still have always had this empire, now has become Christian. Hence, their God must be a hell of a power. He must be a hell of a God. So, even though their cultural models were so different from what the ecclesiastical elites were developing, like, and also the political and social control that they were having in regions like Gaul, etc. But still there was this understanding from the German side that converting to Christian God was being part of the empire itself. Naturally, many of them didn't care. Many would simply say, no, we have to stay to our own gods, to our own deities, in our values, in our fashion. That's why I also mentioned you before Clovis' family, because in there you can see that there were probably different tendencies as much as in the international arena at that point. And yet Clovis chooses this greater model and unavoidably makes his people transitioning into something else. The Franks, the Franks seemingly had some consistent ethnical impact in northern France, because it wasn't a dramatically populated area, especially along the Rhine, in the eastern side of the Belgica region. But however, they would get absorbed and start speaking kind of Romance languages and so on. Of course, Francia extended still in the eastern part, in Austrasia and in Germany as well, and that area would remain heavily Germanized throughout up to the end, we can say, because those areas still speak largely Germanic languages. But let's say, of course, that the center of power remained what would be Western Francia, hence Neustria, and that's in fact where the center of Merovingian power would fundamentally set roots, because there were the major urban centers that were never quite like true capitals, because the Merovingians usually lived in the countryside in these big mansions, etc. But there were still an infrastructural base. There were Roman roads. There were important trade connections, even with Britain, with Northern Europe, of course with Central Europe, and also with the Mediterranean. Here we're still under Clovis. We're still at the beginning. There is a great problem also of the connections with the Mediterranean, because still, especially the Rhone Valley, is still held by the Goths, and things will evolve eventually. Actually, at the time Gregory writing, actually the Franks have expanded also in there. So this is a bit of a different story. But talking about Clovis' perspective, there was the acquisition in 486, as you know, of the kingdom of Syagrius. Basically was what is considered like the last chunk of the Western Empire. This basically a Roman, let's say, barbarian chieftain that was settled there on the name of Rome, right, is wiped out. And Clovis occupies this area. It's pretty big, right? It's not like the lands that the Franks have already occupied in basically in Roman territory on behalf of Rome. That this is really like an entire chunk, in fact, of northern Gaul, and from there they expand further against these other peoples. So initially the situation is still very fluid, but Clovis, step after step consolidates it, and most of the time this happens through the sword, right? And as far as we understand, because this is still alive in Carolingian age, the Franks, Clovis included probably at that point, didn't quite regard much of the Gospels as such. They were actually much more about the Old Testament, right? Of the God Lord of battles. He who can be invoked to win the battle when the situation is critical, right? And this is something you can't find in France still, like in the 13th century, at full Christianization, feudalization of the place. That you read Jean de Joinville, still the idea was like, what do you pray for if God doesn't make you win in battle, right? It's the same exact thing. You understand what kind of degree of Christianization that really was. That is basically still pagan contractualism, or contractualism in general, right? But not different from those bases had been, right? Yet it's a very powerful model, right? It's still a monotheistic model. It's still the idea of a transcendent power that is all power, is all powerful. Doesn't simply act like a local figure. It's really like in paganism. It's beyond. It's the most higher power. That is incidentally the same one of Rome, the same one of the Roman legions now that bring together with them the Christogram, together with their old military legacy and tradition, and the same god of the eagle, right? It's the same exact one. So Clovis embraces this god with the clear intention of making him, of becoming a conqueror in his name. Right? The proto-Christian character that we can define in this way, that is spreading gold at this point, is very important. And I use the term proto-Christian because, as we know, gold now is formally Christianized, right? Of course, the countryside is another thing, but that's still important because while the urban elites are Christianized, the majority of the population is somehow in between paganism and monotheism. And what spreads enormously in this region of Europe is the celebration of saints. Saint Martin of Tours is very important. There would be many others attached also to the same Merovingian dynasty. Think about Saint Denis, that basically represent France, the French monarchy, and all what it truly means. Always remember that France, historically speaking, is nothing else in absolute terms but Saint Denis. Right? That's France, because France is the monarchy. And that's what it always is. And still, today's France is essentially a product of that thing. Now it's a state. It's secularized, whatever, but it's still France, and it's still that thing. It's still that model of power, that idea of its role in the world as well, right? It's this sense that there is no other, that's the center of the world in many ways. And that is transcendent, that it derives from a higher power that is legitimized, right? France is the most Catholic country. This kind of contract, as we have seen now, between its monarchy and God, right? That's the meaning that is said in here. So when looking at celebration of saints and their relics especially, you can immediately see this half like gray area between paganism and Christianity, because Christianity has never fully opened to the idea that relics are magic and they make miracles by themselves, right? It is believed that it happened as such, but it's not such an immediate medium, right? It's not that the relic in itself is just you can't be used like a tool to do that. In paganism, it was conceived like something similar. It was perceived to be inherent in some objects, in some people. This power, this thaumaturgic power, for example, This is very important because, as you know, the French monarchy, with time, will develop, especially this idea of the thaumaturgic power of the king. This doesn't happen just in France, but its roots have been traced, in fact, into these several backgrounds, right? Surely in the Jewish one, but also in the Germanic one, right? Because the idea of the holy anointing, excuse me, and the this physical, this material relation, if you want, with sacred, is strongly at the base, even of certain Germanic practices, right? Of course, also Christ, Lord, is anointed. So this, with Christianity, assumes a very, fully orthodox meaning, even in this context. But still, in Germany, and especially during the migration era, the German paganism had developed this trick, say, from a political point of view, to say that since normally kings weren't accepted as overlords of the community for what we remember before, that is essentially that the society was so primitive and poorly stratified that basically the aristocracies couldn't make it to impose themselves with violence on the whole people, because these were strong enough in arms to reject them, to invent fundamentally that their ancestry was sacred in a way or another, right? There were many setbacks, many failures in this sense, but when the Merovingians extromit all the other aristocrats in the exercise of power, right? So that the idea that even the Merovingians had descended from this sea monster, that also in Germanic tradition there's all a relation with water. It's very complicated actually to talk about this, also because we know very few. But there were some recurring, let's say, ideals, approaches. This idea, the sea was somewhat there. It was from there the peoples had come. This idea of generation of water as source of life, also. But so this was quite important, because you realize that baptism is essentially the same thing. When you are baptized, you begin your Christian existence. And so everything went particularly well, like in a hybrid with this as a meeting ground for these several cultures. This was used by the Merovingians, who basically employed every single mean possible to exercise their power as sole rulers, as dynasts, as monarchs. This is particularly important. The third element that we have seen is is more historicistic one, but yet possibly also the most important, especially at the political and institutional level. That is what made the Merovingian monarchy possible in the first place. That is the Constantinian sacral alliance between the monarch and the church. That was at the base now of the Roman Empire. It's a eminently Roman prerogative that the Merovingians embrace, so that they are Roman in part in their political culture. They understand that here it's not about being kings of a people, or not even of these subjects that they had acquired by conquering Gaul. This was about being emperors, or at least their alter ego, right? Always remember the Franks had gotten now the victory of Gauls by the same empire. They had been Roman federated. They know what the whole deal is, right? And Constantine is perfectly fitting as a model of what is happening between Clovis and the Gallic Church, right? Constantine as protector of the Christian Church, even with some influence in theological affairs. I mean, Constantine had summoned the Council of Nicaea just for telling one, so defining the Christian creed, and there is creating orthodoxy in its sanctioning its dogmas. So this will happen too. Gaul will develop under the Merovingians kind of its own liturgy that was heavily oriented, in fact, towards the celebration of the monarchy as such, and stressing the importance of the sovereign, right, and having, obviously in a very different way from the one Constantine had with the Constantinopolitan Church. In there you have really the state controlling church. In Gaul it wasn't quite the same thing, but the alliance between the Merovingian monarchy and the Gallic Church is so strong that it reminds it never ceases, never rescinds, right? There are other moments in other contexts where you see that the monarchy and the church struggle as well. In France, it's never quite like that. There is always a general convergence between the two models. This is very important because this will make France, at the end of the day, it will allow the French monarchy, that was at one point also very weak, surviving and developing further thanks to this alliance. And Gregory the Great doesn't hesitate to make of Clovis' baptism a second Constantinian baptism. Clovis being baptized is Constantine being baptized. It's the same thing. It's at Tours Basilica, in which the new Constantine, Clovis, receives the purple and the chlamys that at this point, like, they have been associated sometimes to consular powers such, but it's more than that, because the chlamys was at this point the standard ankle-length official garb of high-ranking Roman officials, right? But a chlamys with a broad purple stripe was worn by patricians, and all the emperors wore the purple chlamys, right? And this symbolism, also Clovis arrives not usually with, he arrives on horseback, so he brings even the equestrian model, the Germanic warrior that has to fight on horseback. Think about Frankish cavalry, what will become, right? That will develop mostly in the 8th century as we know it, the professional heavy cavalry of the Carolingian armies. But these peoples all had very clear that still there had been the warrior had to be a horseman, that this was a divine symbology, not just an anecdotal one. The warrior on horseback is as the base of every Indo-European religion at this point, at the sense is the horse as the one that can bring you to the skies as a winner at the side of God, right? Still in the pagan religion, but also in the Christian one in one sense, because who bears the sword and who fights on horseback, and here it's meant to be the emperor as head of state, as head of the army proper, right? So let's not, especially in this Frankish context, let's not separate too much two things. Here Clovis is king of the Franks, right? It's the greatest authority around, right? So this, the embracing of Roman symbols in this process as well is particularly important, because it legitimizes Clovis' authority also in front of the empire, so that he can even call himself Augustus. This is something that the Franks will never forget. Always remember that after the Jews and the Romans, the Franks are the people of God. Like they do not have any other horizon. They're not like the other Germanic peoples. The other Germanic peoples are kind of proud of their own ethnical glory and honor, reputation, and they know they have to respond to the deity of the sky, but they do not see it as a universal power. They think theoretically maybe their power will lead them like heroes, but they're still grounded in this still heroic kind of tribal, even clanic ethos. Here the Franks have developed further into an imperial mindset and an imperialistic policy. The Franks here, not like the other peoples that remain within their own boundaries. From one side you have the Visigoths, they stay there. Side you have the Vandals, they stay there. The other side you see the Ostrogoths, they stay there. They don't swallow our peoples. The Franks start swallowing our people. They start swallowing the Alemanni, the Burgundians. They kick the Visigoths out of Aquitaine. They knock out the Thuringians. They even create the Bavarians as a kind of ducal entity. And we know that further they will have their own empire proper, right? Real, what they call Roman Empire. Imperium Romanum, right? That's how Charlemagne is crowned, right? It's he's the Roman emperor. And he had not invented anything in many ways. That was just a consequence of all of this extremely heavy Roman imperial legacy that the Franks thought they had collected at that point, and especially their ruling dynasty had thought to embody, in part, right? The Franks never give up the fact that they are the Franks, right? They're not Romans. They don't feel themselves as Romans. They feel superior to the Romans, actually. They feel that their conquest of Gaul and of other peoples, and the Christianization and the protection of the holy places and the relics, some of the most important Gallo-Roman centers of Christianity, has made them worthy of God's glory more than what the Roman Empire has done. This is a concept that will live on, historically speaking, even in the relation between the Holy Roman Empire and the Byzantines, is that there was a sense of pride that this mostly dominantly Germanic populations will feel like, yeah, we are the conquerors. We've come here sword in hand and we want this, and this cannot happen without God's will. And here it doesn't matter whether it's the pagan one or the Christian one. This is absolutely no matter, as we will see later. Here the Franks are not really Christianized, right? They have formally Christianized at an elite level, but the rest of the people is barely Christianized, will remain barely Christianized for a very, very long time. This is also Frankish Paradox a little bit, because they're kind of the most Catholic monarchy, but at the same time they're not absolutely the most Catholic people, which is just very evident when Charlemagne, still, in the late 8th century, will have to reform the Frankish church because they basically couldn't even read the Bible. They were that level, that's superficially Romanized. I get triggered sometimes when I hear that the Franks were somewhat Romanized. Yeah, of course, by some degree, you can't say, yeah, they were kind of Romanized in part not. But objectively, if you look at other Romano-Germanic populations, the Goths were way more Romanized. Even if they hadn't embraced Catholicism, they were still Arian. But that, in fact, tells you how politics and religion are here, this level. Two very different things, or at least that religion is weaponized and very cleverly, by the way, but that's not the point. And the Franks have a completely military mindset, warrior mentality. They live as warriors. They are warriors inherently, right? And so it's important to stress that this happened because the Gallo-Roman clergy in Gaul was heavily Romanized. Like, they were extremely faithful to the empire, for example, which is very important. as you know, in the West, the empire basically vanishes in itself. It doesn't crumble. It's simply that at one point it doesn't come anymore. But there is not a moment of break, especially in Gaul. Like at one point, for example, Italy is razed to the ground by the Gallic War, right? And that changes deeply society. For which, when the Longobards arrived, that Longobard model will become prevalent, kind of very heavily Germanized. Gaul didn't. The elites remained strongly Roman under a certain point of view. Of course, they barbarized and partly Germanized. At this point, Gallo-Roman bishops are not like simple civilians, as you know, the Roman senators in their civilian life would be. These were starting being actually chieftains on their own, like military leaders were very powerful clienteles and money and land and serfs. That's also where, as we've said many times in many videos, the vassalic beneficiary system actually stems from, right? The Carolingians accelerated brutally, but in the essentials it was already there since the late Roman Empire. And the reason why individuals like Gregory of Tours also are so willing to now grant the Franks the palm of victory, this role that had been of Rome, is that they needed a new authority, right? Or better, the same Roman authority of the empire in a moment of great shortage of it, or severe shortage of the same. That is, while in Rome, in fact, there is no emperor anymore, right? So the West is on its own. And secondly, the one of Constantinople is, at this point, very inclined to monophysitism. So basically you have a West where there is no overruler. You have the East, in which the Byzantine emperors are basically concerned in trying to keep together all the eastern provinces that want to autonomize themselves and not to pay taxes and bring this heresies like monophysitism as their flag, like, and therefore the emperor tries to appease them by winking at them on a doctrinal base. And this is a serious problem. Like, always remember that in the early Middle Ages, actually the West, in spite of its superficial Romanization, was much more orthodox than the East. Like, the East was doing this pretty messed up stuff, like, in fact, supporting back and maybe even some all the major, aside maybe from Roman Africa and some other minor events, but all the major doctrinal troubles had come from the East. The West was very fair at this point. We were very stern, very fair, very orthodox, and was very scandalized even by what was happening in Constantinople. Secondly, think at what it means for especially for an elite like the Gallo-Roman one. It had always been framed within an empire that is not just a state like all others. It's literally the empire that rules all over the known world, because Rome objectively had ruled all over the known world. Doesn't matter that the world was larger. At the time they didn't know that. That was the known world, and that was it. There were no boundaries. That was the universal empire created by God. Think of what it means not to have this opportunity of being part of a universal empire. So this Frankish king now that has arrived, who is so squared and very determined, very effective, right? Very capable. He's a leader of man. He's a warrior. He's a fighter. He has a mind. He's intelligent. He's powerful, right? He owns the the imperium, you could say, right, in perspective. Because even if legally it wasn't so, religiously it was, right? The Roman Empire, as we've explained 1,000 times, has its only legitimization at all times in history exclusively in religion. The concept of imperium is merely religious. There is no other meaning attached to it. So it's he who holds the imperium factually, who detains power, who is legitimized to rule. And this is something that, in fact, the Western Empire will always bring forward when the Byzantines will say that they were the only Romans, right? And this guy said, but we're ruled now, sword in hand in the West. So the Bible says it as well, that you have to obey to that authority, and this authority is Christian, incidentally, and we are the one who detain this authority. So we are here on behalf of God ruling this land. We are emperors on our true regard. And it's a big deal, right? Very big deal, because at one point, especially Carolingian times, will show that this was a freaking amazing power. Nobody had ever achieved that after Roman times in the West. So even the Byzantines had to be quite careful about it. This is a moment in history in which still there is no other perspective but the one of the universal empire. Today we think the empire ended because the western half ended. Not only the empire continued from Constantinople, and that's essentially the same empire without any discontinuity, but in Europe, in the Mediterranean, everyone was part of the empire. Like, nobody ever felt like, I'm here in Gaul and I don't see any emperor, hence we are not in the Roman Empire. These people believed that we're still living in the empire. And it was objectively so, because also all the political, all the administration, etc., albeit transformed, so it was still with the Roman one. In southern Gaul, there was no Roman government, yet the local mints still produced Roman imperial coins. They traded extensively with Constantinople. It was a pretty, even you look at the laws that the Burgundians or the Visigoths emanated, that were essentially Roman laws adapted a little bit to what the local society had transformed, also with the Germanic element, but basically it was the same thing. So this is not a new concept, right? In part, of course, when the West will contract within itself, this ideal will be blurred, right? But as soon as Europe revives in the 8th century, this thing is brought forward once again. Then now we look at the High Middle Ages, we say, oh yeah, now here there is the Holy Roman Empire in the West that cannot rule anything, and here the Byzantine in the East that, is always under siege, and it's powerful, but it can't expand further, and in the end it falls. So we that's a moment of crisis of many institutions, and we tend to see that universalism declines, right? But for a very long time, this thing, including those moments, universalism was still alive. You can say up to the 13th century, was no other way to see the world but through the lenses of the empire. There was no other way, right? Not even the Muslims were seen as part of something like Islam. The Christians thought that they were dealing with schismatic bishops of some Eastern heresy, right? Christian heresy. It's very important, because this informs all the political and institutional culture at that point. And everything comes through that in its logic. So the natural consequence is that when Clovis subdues Gaul, defeats all the enemies, brings Catholicism in, the Arians disappear from the south, Clovis remains appears to remain in the works of these authors as the legitimate heir of Constantine and of Theodosius, right? Of Constantine the Great, Theodosius the Great. So those who had basically reunified the empire after the civil wars between Romans, right? The two big emperors that had held the empire all in one block with the power of their armies, right? So the only tutor of the imperial dignity and of faith altogether. This importance of unity is paramount in the whole picture. This is meant to be an ecumenic power. Like imperial power, the way it is, naturally the Franks didn't conceive themselves an ecumenic power like Rome was, but they felt to be part of that commonwealth at that point. I use the term commonwealth and not empire because obviously the world was Roman, but the Romans didn't rule everywhere, right? This place, it's the Franks who rule, so they share the cake, and with this legitimization as the cherry on top from a divine and imperial point of view, and this exalts the Franks. Like the Franks begin to develop this idea of God's predilection for them, and definitely also the continuity between Roman imperial Christianism and the Frankish Christian monarchy, right? This is what really substantiates the work of Gregory of Tours, and also the same activity of the Gallic Church at this time. Because aside from literary abstractions, we know that the Gallic Church starts to actively back and support the Merovingian monarchy and to be its most powerful ally with this reciprocal aid. Monarchy protects the church legitimizes and sacralizes the monarchy. And that's how the Franks rise to the power, to immense power that in the 6th century they really hold. And the Byzantine Empire is scared at this point. Like the Romans start looking at this in a pretty concerned way. And in fact, I made even a video about this, talking about Justinian's reconquest, talking about this what I call the an Atlantic perspective, that is to say, basically counter-Frankish perspective. That is to say that more than the Arian kingdoms of the Goths and of the Vandals, the main deal was being Merovingian Gaul, right? That was expanding on the surrounding populations at an alarming rate, so that even some pagan or Arian powers had started looking at Constantinople like saying, are you letting us being conquered by these? And therefore Justinian's attempt to reconquer the West, partially successful, albeit fairly short-lived by certain standards, but still, in my opinion, very, very functional, very intelligent. It wasn't a waste. Like it was a problem afterwards because of unpredictable things that happened, including the plague, a lot of other stuff that really started things taking another direction. But there was a lot of clarity in what the Byzantines were doing at that point. And we know, just to make you understand how deeply the bond between the Merovingians and the Gallo-Roman elites was, we have to look at what happened in either 568 or 569. So a moment that is already moment of slow decline. This is the year in which the Longobards are invading Italy, and at one point the that creates a bit of a problem, because the Franks were already looking at Italy as the next expansion ground. In fact, at the end of the Gothic War, just 13 years before, they had basically invaded Italy while the Byzantines were there, and they were defeated eventually. But so basically, the Franks and the Byzantines come all together against the Longobards at that point. That make it true, the only truth, against them. Partially because of this crisis that had already began, the plague, the epidemics, that Italy is invaded basically because there is no one to guard it anymore. The mobile armies elsewhere. And therefore this brings the Franks and the Byzantines all together. But also from the attempts to kick out the Longobards and the consequent failure to achieve that, you can't say things are crumbling yet. What happened in Francia now has perfectly functioned in there for the Franks at the center of Frankish power, because in the plains of Poitiers in these years there was the meeting of two processions that had to escort nothing else but the relics of the Holy Cross that were coming from the east. And what the Franks do while they accompany these processions is they start to sing highly, majestically, solemnly, with the triumphal verse of the Roman legionaries, the Pange lingua gloriosi prelium certaminis, which is a beautiful hymn by Venantius Fortunatus. Now we will read that as soon as it ends will succeeded by another hymn, always by Venantius, the Vexillum Regis, or Vexilla Regis, actually, as it was rendered now in the modern, like it simply different between singular and plural. And these are two beautiful hymns that now we'll read both of them actually, into which Venantius Fortunatus, that was, by the way, the same biographer of Martin of Tours, and he was a bishop of Poitiers himself, right? Makes vibrating all the sense of Constantine's religious experience that is relived through Clovis. And in this symbology, you have all the Constantinian symbology replicated in the Frankish one, in the Merovingian one, because the cross is the royal insignia, symbol of triumph. And this is all, like, let's read them first and then let's comment a second. So I will read it in Latin. The Pange lingua gloriosi prelium certaminis, right, which means sing tongue, the battle of glorious combat, right? Pange lingua gloriosi prelium certaminis, et super crucis trofeo dic triumphum nobilem, qualiter redemptor orbis immolatus vicerit. De parentis protoplasti fraude factor condolens, quando pomi noxialis morte morsu corruit, ipse lignum tunc notavit damna ligniut solveret. Hoc opus nostre salutis ordo deposcherat, multiformis perditoris arte ut artem falleret, et medelam ferret inde hostis unde leseret. Quando venit ergo sacri plenitudo temporis, missus est ab arce patris natus orbis conditor, atque ventre virginali carne factus prodiit. Vagit infans inter arta conditus praesepia, membra pannis involuta virgo mater adliget, et pedes manusque crura stricta pingit fascia. Lustra sex, quam iam per acta tempus implens corporis, se volente, natus ad hoc, passioni deditus, agnus in crucis levatur immolandus stipit. Hic autem fel arundo sputa clavi lance, mite corpus perforator, sanguinis unda profluit, terra pontus astra mundus quo lavantur flumine. Crux fidelis inter omnes arbor una nobilis nulla talem silva profert flore, fronde germine, dulce lignum, dulce clavo, dulce pondus sustinens, flecte ramos arbor alta tensa laxa viscera, et rigor lentescat ille, quem dedit nativitas, ut superni membra regis mite tendas stipite. Sola digna, tu fuisti ferre pretium seculi, atque portum preparare nauta mundo naufrago, quem sacer cruor perunxit fusus agni corpore. This is of an extraordinary beauty. Let's translate it. Sing, my tongue, the Saviour's glory. Tell his triumph far and wide. Tell aloud the famous story of his body crucified. How upon the cross a victim, vanquishing in death he died. Eating of tree forbidden, managed sunk in Satan's snare, when our pitying Creator did the second tree prepare, destined many ages later that first evil to repair. Such the order God appointed, when foreseen he would atone to the serpent thus opposing schemes yet deeper than his own. Thence the remedy procuring, whence the fatal wound had come. So when now at length the fullness of the sacred time drew nigh, then the Son, the world's Creator, left his Father's throne on high. From a virgin's womb appearing, clothed in our mortality, all within a lowly manger, lo, a tender babe he lies. See his gentle virgin mother, lulled to sleep his infant cries, while the limbs of God incarnate round with swathing bands she ties. Thus did Christ perfect manhood in our mortal flesh attain, then of his free choice he goeth to a death of bitter pain, and as a lamb upon the altar of the cross for us is slain. Lo, with gall his thirst he quenches, see he thorns upon his brow, nails his tender flesh are rending, see his side is opened now, whence to cleanse the whole creation streams of blood and water flow. Faithful cross above all other, on an only noble tree, none in foliage, none in blossom, none in fruit thy peers may be. Sweetest wood and sweetest iron, sweetest weight is hung on thee. Lofty tree, bend down thy branches to embrace the sacred load, or relax the native tension of that all too rigid wood. Gently, gently bear the members of thy dying King and God. Tree which solely wast found thee worthy, the world's victim to sustain. Harbor from the raging tempest, ark that saved the world again. Tree with sacred blood anointed, of the Lamb for sinners slain. So, and this is very beautiful. As you understand, this is about the divine sacrifice. This is very important, right? Because this naturally talks about the cross. Here there is all the invocation to the cross as such, and in this extremely violent culmination of the passion of Christ, that obviously is referred to the relics that were being transported in here in the moment in which the hymn was sung, and that emphasizes a lot, like every passion of Christ is blood, because blood is life. Here blood is naturally representing the sacrifice, and what is deep here, in my opinion, is looking at eventually the vexilla regis that follows, right? So that now we will pair with it, but in this sense as the greater sacrifice that here in a very violent world was paid in order to reestablish what this order is, right? Because revelation here is about to be accomplished fully, and this is how the Merovingian order was conceived, right? It was earned in blood, as we were saying. Conversion happened in the bloodiest moment. You can see here even the refusal of God, initially speaking. So like St. Peter, the idea that Clovis was a step ahead from annihilation, from eternal death, from disappearance, from darkness. He chooses God. He chooses the cross and the light in the sky, and he wins. And through that victory, he converts, and he converts formally his people. So the kingdom is violently expanded, as we've seen. So this is even more meaningful, and all this reference to blood. Now, Penances Fortunatus is one of the most famous Latin poets of his times. Naturally, there is all the Roman literary legacy here, but think about what the blood actually meant for the Franks. The Franks, as we will see now, up to very late in time, still carry out human sacrifices. Yes, they did. Do you realize what this means? Do you realize what this hymn sublimates here? This is not, this is a real death. These are people who have seen blood, and a lot of blood. These people know what the sacrifice means. They have shed their own blood to achieve it. In a warrior society, in a warrior culture, this death is in front of everybody's eyes. It's a terrible world, right? The establishment of this kingdom, that is the marvel of the West at this point, because it's able to extend this power in a way that no other Romano-Germanic people has managed to achieve, and it will never be able to in the future, if not through the same Franks. It's been expanded, sword in hand, spilling a lot of that blood. So the insistence on this, even in these hymns, that this is purely referred to God's sacrifice on the cross, and to the cross in itself, right? This is dedicated to the cross properly, in this occasion of the transportation of the relics of the true cross, but is meant as something more. It's a meeting point of sacrificial cultures. But let's read the Vexilla Regis. That are very important. It's also this was always by Penances, and it sounds like this in Latin: Vexilla Regis prodeunt, fulget crucis mysterium, quo carnis conditor, suspensus est patibulo. Ocrux ave spes unica, hoc passionis tempore, auge piis justitiam, reisque dona veniam. Te summa Deus Trinitas, collaudet omnis spiritus, quos per crucis mysterium salvas rege per saecula. Amen. So this means the royal banner forward goes, the mystic cross refulgent glows, where he in flesh who made, upon the tree of pain is laid. O cross, all hail, sole hope abide with us now in this patient tide. New grace in pious hearts implant, and pardon to the guilty grant. Thee, mighty Trinity, one God, let every living creature laud, whom by the cross thou dost deliver, O guide and govern now and ever. Amen. So this is beautiful as well. This is really like more powerful. This is obviously an invocation to the deity to lead on, right? Both society, like here the royal banner is meant to, like what? Vexilla, right? The Rex is Christ, right? But this is not a surprise. This is not anecdotal. This is a Rex, just like Clovis was, right? Clovis was bearing Christ's ensigns now. Here resounds naturally this is all about God. But it begins with this phrase that look at the first and the last line. It sounds like the royal banner forward goes, O guide and govern now and ever. Right, this is very meaningful. This is a monarchic hymn in Christ, of course, but it has a deeper political meaning. It means now that society is guided by the cross, and the vexillum is a military ensign. Very meaningful, right? So this is a military march. Let's be honest. This stuff is written after the two hymns are written after the Roman legionary chants of the Constantinian era. This is a military march. This is the relics of the Holy Cross marching in a military fashion. This is a militant, right? The Militia Christi is something St. Paul even comes up with. I made a video about the Militia Christi as well. So that's the subtlety of Christianity, if you want, in his political message. It's never fully clear, if not for the reason that God and kings are separated. They operate on different planes, but humanity lives in its earthly dimension, and what is present in heaven is reflected on earth. And Christianity accepts implicitly the existence of an earthly authority. Certain things will always happen. Here, the Merovingians are escorting the crosses, the fragments of the Holy Cross throughout their lands, and acclaiming them essentially as their guide, as they taking Christ as a guide, most evidently as a military guide. Through sacrifice, through the ensigns, through blood. This is the base of it all. The purple represents blood. Never forget this. That's what Clovis had come wearing at Tours for his baptism on horseback. Think about what that means. That is fundamental. This is a military triumph. And it exemplifies the Frankish Christianization obtained through victories, miracles, and spread through the will and the example of the sovereigns. This is directly inspired to the Old Testament. They always remember that the Franks were obsessed by the Old Testament. Basically, they didn't care about the Gospels. Basically, the only there is here definitely a historicistic inspiration to the history of the empire and of the church. These are all Constantinian models in the two hymns. But there is actually a very few about the Gospel, and exclusively basically about those that concern a royal exegesis. That is the figure of Christ as Lord, as Judge, Supreme Judge, as the Pantocrator, right? So the ruler of the universe, right? So a real leader, a real king of the Jews and of the Christians, of course, of humanity. This is extremely important. The Franks were looking exclusively about this, and that's the way through which the even the sacred royalty of the early Germans was receiving a Christian sanction. Because always remember that aside from the elites, now there was still a people that had settled in here, and naturally Romanization took time. The Franks still made the army, and they were the ones that had allowed Clovis to win his wars and to obtain his victories and to extend their own power. So this is not just about the elites, this is about the Frankish people and Frankish subjects in accepting fundamentally the monarchic direction, right? There is the episode, for example, of the that's a bit more contractualistic, but it stays within, in fact, the Germanic mindset. The episode of the Vase of Soissons that Gregory of Tours talks about, and basically when Clovis had conquered Soissons, he had obtained some, they had collected all the loot, as it was tradition, and they would share it. Like, all the warriors would take their own part in kind of more or less equal numbers. Now what happens is that the Bishop of Tours, that had his church looted by the Franks, who were still pagan, right, at this point. This is before the conversion, of course. Goes to Clovis. First of all, this is very important because the ecclesiastical authority recognizes Clovis as an interlocutor. This is very important because this already, in providential perspective, is meaning that Clovis, first of all, was already open to receive this message and to recognize, to tribute respect, as we'll see now, to the bishop. And the bishop asks Clovis to render him this vase that was part of the church's paraphernalia that were sacred, and it was particularly important. And Clovis, here I would like to stress the fact that Clovis is a pagan Germanic warrior, which means that Christian ethics in practice is completely the opposite of his own, right? Christ is a lamb that gets butchered passively. Germans are basically all about being the butchers, right? So talking to a bishop that was even considered, Germans believed in virility and this idea of manhood of the warrior. What is a bishop? Well, okay, at this time bishops technically could still marry, but there were still, especially bishops proper, not the other priests, were already seen a bit in a poor manner, let's say, if they had a wife and children, because theoretically that was distracting from their office, right? The temptations of flesh and all this stuff. So these stories are often, obviously, actually always told by stressing the chastity, however, the moderation of this clergyman, right? So you have the two opposites, right? So an average German chieftains would have even maybe killed the bishop, or however, maybe not even received him, because he didn't. A man talks only to a man in that warrior context. Like, bishop is considered as a lower. Instead, Clovis receives him, and he agrees. He doesn't promise him really anything. He says, "Okay, if I find this vase among the loot, I will give it to you back, but I can't promise it." So what happens is that Clovis goes to the other warriors that are to split the loot, and he finds the vase, and he says to the other Franks, like, this vase is mine. You can't take what pertains to you, but this vase belongs to me. Now, there's a warrior who's very hot-tempered and represents probably the most, in fact, perfect Germanic model in the sense, who says, who are you basically to... Like, he doesn't say it openly, but he disagrees, because he rightly thinks, from his Germanic perspective, that loot is for him, right? Like, is for everybody, theoretically, that had to participated to this victory, because these people have fought actually against Siagri's men, etc. So they have risked their lives, and they were doing it for the sake of loot. And this chieftain, that albeit powerful, was still theoretically a freeman, asking for, like, I want that and you have just to obey, was considered an insult to the egalitarianism. So what this Germanic hot-tempered warrior does is that something pretty stupid in inside, because he basically smashes the vase and destroyed it. So at that point nothing happens. Like, you can imagine all the Frankish warriors freezing, like, oh my gods, right at that point, saying, what the hell now is going to happen? You can imagine how Clovis looked at this guy at that point, but he doesn't do anything. Now that's the difference between a chieftain and a warrior. Like, the chieftain is not just brave and courageous, he has already demonstrated that he's also wise and intelligent, right? The warrior is just hot-tempered. So Clovis, basically the meaning of that was, you want the vase, now break it, take it, right? So Clovis basically takes all of these pieces of the vase and kind of sticks them together and renders them back to the bishop. Now that's very important, because he could have said that, well, screw that, I will not give it back to the bishop anymore. No. He obviously recognizes that that person has asked for his stuff back, and he had kind of the dignity and the guts even to stand up to him in that sense, like making that question, and he gives it the rests of the broken vase to him. Now what happens is, for 1 year doesn't happen anything, but after 1 year, without anything going on, Clovis meets that Germanic warrior in the open, publicly. He goes to him, he takes his sword out of his belt, he throws it on the ground. Now the sword is a symbol of Germanic honor, pride, virility, whatever, right? Throws it on the ground. So this is basically like an offense that you wash with blood. Like, there are no other ways in Germanic society to solve that. That's an insult to someone's manhood, honor. What this guy does is that he kneels to take his sword back. In that moment, Clovis grabs his axe and splits his skull open like a cucumber. And in front of the corpse he says, just like the vase of Soissons. This is the tender and cute story about the vase of Soissons. And it's of immense beauty. I mean, anthropologically speaking, it makes you understand literally everything about the Germans. These were all about such things. What happens with Clovis is that he has gone beyond. Clovis is, and the amazing thing is that Gregory of Tours, that is a Gallo-Roman, writes this means that he knew perfectly what the Germans were about, right? And Clovis has gone beyond, because Clovis is telling the truth, something very dark in perspective. That even today, like, if everybody is equal to another, how can you impose something to someone else? Like asking what is due to him for yourself and taking it without any. But Clovis can do it because he's like the best warrior ever. He's the chieftain. He's the leader. He obviously wins. Hence, he enforces that with violence, which is essentially what the state does. But the state, albeit taking away freedom, still performs a service, and he takes this, the sense of the story, takes the civilization to the next step, so that the warrior actually screwed up pretty badly, because in front of that guy he smashes the same thing that theoretically belonged to everyone. So you see in there that the deep metaphor is that the individual guy doesn't know what to do with his own freedom, and you need a ruler to tell him what to do. Naturally, the guy dies because, at that point there was no way out of that. And Clovis does more than winning a battle or taking loot. He founds an empire. This is the moral of the story. And as dark as it is, it's still probably one of the single most, and let's say, most beautiful aside, yeah, of course, from a literary point of view, but one of the deepest realizations probably you can make about history is that civilization passes through horrifying things, through loss of freedom, through blood, in fact. The same one of Venantius' hymns. It passes through sufferance, it takes destruction, it takes something that can't be brought back like it was before. Like the vase of Soissons. But there is justice. This is a history of justice, essentially. And the justice can be delivered just by the ruler, which is what Christianity realizes. Right? That there has to be a ruler on this earth that is behaving on behalf of God. And Clovis doesn't know it yet because he's still a pagan. But he will know that. He will eventually be conquered by Christianity, and his behavior with the bishop already shows that he had been fair. So that's a beautiful story that tells all about Clovis, right? So with Christianization, what happens is that King Christ becomes measure of the kings, of human kings, and the sovereign, conversely, becomes a typus Christi, which means that basically this is the Christomimesis fundamentally. So that the sovereign has to imitate Christ, and this Frankish monarchy will always stress partly this idea. This point is just, in fact, very theoretical, but in the future, even French kings, etc., will always be considered kind of stern, kind of serious, authoritative, also in a Christ-like fashion, right? There is even a sense of Caesar papism. And at one point, think about Philip IV. In the 14th century, there is the idea that the French king is at the head of the French church. Not even the Pope can question that, and that therefore there is an innate sacrality within the same monarch. Well, it all begins from here. It begins from Clovis, at least for what concerns this area of France. And so there is the very heavy and rich and problematic history of the baptism of Clovis that today we don't look at directly, but it's the debate stems principally from the fact that, of course, the whole historiography stressed this event as a revolution, like as a miracle, first of all, and as the single most important thing basically had happened in Gaul, in the West, and that would have so many important consequences for the development also the Frankish kingdom and eventually the Carolingian Empire. It's objectively very important. But what I would like to talk to you about today is also another thing, that is what was actually happening at a lower level, because opposed to this baptism, there is actually the incredibly weak and kind of superficial Christianization of the Franks. As I was telling you about before, this is Frankish Paradox, and it doesn't take much to understand that such Christianization was eventually imposed and required from and pushed for and urged from the above, right, from the monarchy in itself. And we actually know a lot of things also about the modalities of this formal conversion, because a geographical literature for Gaul shows us very clearly how the evangelization work actually didn't act quite subtly at all, because backed by sovereign authority, the missionaries came to eradicate from the soil the sacred trees, they overthrew the idols, they destroyed the places of cult. This is particularly hard to read, but it's also logical that the violence and the rapidity of this work of Christianization didn't actually help much its depth, right? Because given that Clovis had objected a lot of power, and that he had become Christian because he was struck by the power of the new god, well, the Franks surely converted a bit for fear, a bit for convenience, and formally, in short, right? Just imagine the picture of that. Like, you're an average Frankish warrior, you have fought under Clovis, you had your share of fortune, you settled in Gaul with your family, you took some land, you started administering it, having serfs, and entering this circles of society. The contact with the Gallo-Romans allowed, I don't know, your children to become, okay, maybe not literate, but to be acquainted to, some a higher form of learning and of exemplars and of general awareness about the world that probably got you curious in some measure. So probably the most average subject didn't quite experience this all, but it's obvious that, as we've said many times, that even at a very low level of society, especially in the countryside, nobody actually cared whether you were converted or not. So definitely certain areas of cults were destroyed, others were simply transformed, but the local beliefs would have largely remained, right? And this probably was pushed in terms of modalities by the same Clovis. Like, he probably understood that it wasn't much of a big deal of literally converting everyone. It was just about him and his family as a ruling dynasty now, to be formally Christian, to have a good relation with the local church, and the enormous latifundian lands in general, and traffics, etc., that they controlled, and to share its benefits. And the rest of the people could be more or less, it's brutal destruction of idols and whatever could be brief, short, formal, just to prove that in front of the ecclesiastical hierarchies that had taken place. But the same hierarchies didn't quite care at the end of the day whether the average Frankish peasant at this point still held some belief that couldn't factually be controlled. Like in the 6th century, there was no coercive power to obtain that, to achieve that. So, in practice, the new word must have touched the Franks very, very few. And their paganism, free of this further suggestions and modifications must have somewhat frozen, right? That means that he must have remained largely intact, actually, under, beneath the changed Christian clothes, right? Appearances. This is important because it's like northern France, the Benelux area, northwestern Germany, where the Franks ruled. But it wasn't much of a very Romanized area. Like it was largely similar to Germany, especially the eastern part, right? The western part probably, like, even the Franks were absorbed, ethnically speaking, demographically speaking, very, very soon. Like, northern French, yeah, it's kind of different from the south, but still a Latin world, basically. So, the context here is looking even at material culture, right? Towards the mid-7th century, for example, that's the moment in which we start seeing that the Frankish people could be called as actually Christianized, right? Before that, there are no sure traces of Christian faith. For example, in the tombs studied by the archaeologists Sallen and Fremersdorf, seemingly there is nothing Christian about the Franks. Now, as you know, graves are very important because the Germanic warriors buried themselves with a lot of objects, and before Christianization, this is the rule, right? Even of people like the Alemanni, you see that the Alemanni never actually converted to Christianity. It's not that there is a moment in which but by the 8th century they were probably still large pagan, and therefore we can't find goods still in their graves. Then after Christianization, that doesn't happen anymore. So there is no proof that Clovis conversion actually brought to the mass conversion of the Franks, which is yet another proof that when we talk about religion here, this is a strictly political affair. This is not about what people actually believed. Probably not even the Gallo-Roman senators were kind of 100% Christianized. They probably still held some belief of the ancient Roman culture, maybe even of the local Celtic substratum. It's a world that doesn't matter who got converted first or later, still has acquainted monotheism since very recently. This is a world that for millennia had been pagan, right? So that's the real deal, right? So, and it's not important at the ends of the construction of the Merovingian monarchy. That's especially a matter of elites. As long as the elites stick together, they function. There is the possibility of launching military expeditions. There is a base to support that. There is a kind of administration that the Merovingians start, telling the truth, from the 6th century with the counts. And there is a lot of Roman continuity in there too, this picture. Like, it's obvious, right? Well, the Franks were already acquainted with Gaul, and then they occupy some of still the most intact areas of the empire that will, in this sense, very slowly transform over time into something different. And there is a very strong hybrid between the Germanic element and the Roman element, and the Gallo-Roman, let's say better. This is quite important. So, more simply, the authoritarian and rapid character of the official conversion of the Franks didn't accelerate the substantial times that remained long, right? They simply, however, this process had an impact in the sense that it deteriorated the quality of Christianization in itself. This was a real problem for the Franks eventually, when they will have to start making their society work on a kind of a more more efficient administrative base in the Carolingian times. Much of the fall of the Carolingian Empire derived essentially from this lack of not really lack of Christianization in itself, but rather the lack, for example, care for literacy, or the idea of developing a power that was based on a sound Roman administration. And it wasn't anything like that. The same and I say this because the church was the only element at this point that was safeguarding that. So in these Central European areas, much of this gets lost at one point, the meeting and fusion between the old and the new creed is important, because it allows still this system to stand and function, but at the same time doesn't quite it's very slow. It doesn't give the bust that could derive from a sharp contrast between like those who want to re-Romanize, like for example, the Aryan peoples at one point had this problem that they had to convert to Catholicism, like the Visigoths had, and they converted. The Vandals were basically converting before they were wiped out. The Ostrogoths also were about to have. The Longobards basically convert, also with less problems actually, but that was another story. So with Gaul, the story is of relative development, because also for geographical reasons, because actually northern the area of Francia proper, as we've said, was not immensely Romanized. So actually the real Roman stock, like of administration, of local traditions, etc., was present in regions where the Franks would always remain kind of peripheral to, like Aquitaine, also the Rhone Valley. Those were intensely Romanized areas, like very, very Romanized, almost like Italy at one point. But those were kind of far, in fact, developed in very autonomous ways, and up to the High Middle Ages, even the Low Middle Ages, will remain fundamentally detached from the northern French monarchy that was developing instead something very different up there. And so the confrontation is, we don't know of any, like, Clovis' conversion had been immediate. That was one of the greatest investments of Clovis, like the fact that he didn't linger into this stage like of Arianism. He simply passed from paganism to Catholicism. He solved all the problems of eventual persecutions, of opposition of the clergy, etc. And on the contrary, he engaged immediately the church in this. That was the most Roman element of the Frankish kingdom into the construction of the monarchy, and therefore he gets full support immediately. And that's why basically the Frankish kingdom holds after all, because it kind of evaporates in terms of actual governability, but it's still there, and the Carolingians managed to revive it at one point, because there is already a structure that has been working in a way or another in certain dynamics, right? When there are people who even say that between the 6th and the 7th century, paganism, albeit officially put aside, had a sort of revanche, right? There was a comeback of paganism in certain areas in a certain degree, because it had never been wiped out. Or maybe there was even the need of a comeback, because it had always been there, remained there without too many problems at the end of the day. And even this idea of a kind of re-Germanization of Carolingian of Frankish culture under Carolingian times is a thing, which doesn't mean that was actually a repaganization of the empire, but it was of Frankish culture, excuse me, but that certain we can't say national traditions were reinforced. For example, but just to make an example, the Lex Salica, so the Salian law, still mentions, even if accidentally actually, the practice of animal sacrifice. So that tells you that normally the Franks, even when they Christianized, they sacrificed animal to whom? Because that's the question, probably to the gods, to the ancient gods, to the ancient deities, this magical naturalistic entities, but maybe even to Saint God. It was a lot of syncretism as well. The same Procopius of Caesarea actually stated as a witness that at the time of the Gothic War, the already Catholic Franks, in brackets, propitiated themselves victory in battle through human sacrifices, which means that, I mean, the Franks were Catholic, but they're still making human sacrifices. Now, I would like to make you reflect on what this means. I mean, do you realize exactly what it means to make a human sacrifice? Let's leave aside the cruelty and the gratuitous violence in itself, but basically, if you make a human sacrifice, it's basically you believe, you're convinced of the fact that there is a return to you from the divinity, and the more you do that, and actually that's a human sacrifice, it's not just an animal sacrifice, you sacrifice a human being, that's gonna pay more for, right? So if you come from such a mindset, what is extraordinary in the picture is how Clovis managed to do that, because Clovis reasonably was part of this whole thing. So that tells you even more what the size of the historical figure of Clovis really is. I mean, these authors were right in stating that it was a new Constantine. I mean, Constantine had wiped out 3 emperors, one brother-in-law, his wife, his son. Maybe not a very recommendable person, but he founded something that would last for a millennium. And Clovis founded something that lasted for even more than that. With all the continuities and transformations, of course, like it's a bit different, but the impact that this man had, just for a choice that is a cultural choice, a choice of courage. As we were saying at the beginning, Clovis was son of a most loyal servant of Rome, and fully kind of Germanist in the sense of, a Thuringian from the hardest internationally militant anti-Roman, anti-Christian bloc, right? As his mother, as a Thuringian. So just think at the courage that this man had, aside from fighting and risking his life and going against his own people, killing all those nobles that he literally knocked out physically, right? Was a bath of blood. In the choice that he made, I mean, if you come from a background where you still believe in things like human sacrifices, what it means to pass through the other side and accept that for the sake of power, whatever you want to, maybe, but you can't even underestimate the spiritual dimension here, because if you believe in human sacrifice, you can easily believe in a lot of things, in the sense, but with all of yourself, right? Meaning that you truly believe that that's a deal with the divinity. So objectively, the greatness of Clovis' political and military accomplishments is extraordinary, but it's even more so if framed into the mindset of those times. What a 6th century Germanic chieftain could have in his mind to push him to sacrifice to the altar of Christian God an empire and his own beliefs and his own tradition, his own past. That's one of the greatest sacrifices you can ever make. Has costed a lot of people's lives. And that's where it gets controversial, because from that kingdom will emerge something from which the same modern Europe owes a lot to the Carolingian Empire and a lot of other things that naturally Clovis was not directly responsible for, in the sense that he didn't think of, like, can't read in the future in that sense, but that started from that. And yet it passed through the loss of freedom, the loss of life. And this is, I think, in a nutshell, the history of civilization. That at one point, a sacrifice is required to take a step further. And you lose innocence, you lose faith, because basically you have to abandon what you believe in. You have to pass to something else. And there is no reward in this sense, if not that you, for yourself probably at that point, because maybe you feel redeemed, maybe that's where redemption kicks in, maybe you do feel redeemed, maybe that's your reward, but that's a reward loaded with the atrocious thinking that there is no coming back for your choices. And this is incidentally what Christianity actually stresses in some way, because from one side there is the redemption, like no man is beyond redemption, but at the same time what you do falls on your responsibility, so that what you do is not just something you can wash away by saying, okay, I redeem myself, that we're cool, point, because that wakes in God's design. It's part of the idea of, think even at those who have to bear the sword. There is this inherent, which is apparently a contradiction, but really is not in Christianity itself, that there is to be someone who has to rule, who has to bear the sword. Here it was the emperor conceptually, right, or the king in this case. But killing is a sin for Christianity. And yet, with some interpretations, of course, that can make you also legitimately doubt whether the Christian intention was essentially that. But there is a part of Christianity which justifies a earthly order, and that comes through violence, through people bearing the sword and delivering justice, right? When in the Gospel, in the New Testament, you find the statement that do not think that those who rule are here in vain. Like, there is always a divine design, so that such things must happen because God has wanted that, and you don't have to question that. Now think of what that feels when you are the one who delivers that, when you can't sleep at night because of the doubts, of the regrets, of the horrible feelings that derive from slaughtering entire populations and subduing them, and but still thinking that this falls into a divine design, that whatever this goes, like whatever you end up like, there is still something that carries on. This is a deep realization. It's dark, but it's the same time how civilization progressed. Gregory of Tours, these other authors were quite happy about Frankish rule, because finally in Gaul there was a new authority. So there weren't like other people's going around destroying it. No, now there was an authority. And reflect about that, because that may have instated itself through that sacrifice. But now that preserves. Just think about public order. That's important. You want to trade part of your free will, your freedom, for living in a place where you don't have to go out of your house risking being killed by someone. And that's sad, but it's needed at the moment in real life. This is what these authors were thinking of Clovis, and depicted him like he who had delivered this order by divine sanction for good. And this is, aside from the Franks and Clovis, this happens also in other Romano-Germanic kingdoms. Like, there are sources that are sometimes even completely, like, that they're not part of the elite. Obviously here Gregory of Tours, this are at a high level. They are part of the elite in great part. But there are other authors elsewhere that basically state, no, we're happy that there are these guys here that, yeah, came as conquerors, but now, there is stability. Well, before there wasn't. Yeah, that's deep, and that's very, very interesting. But there are more traces, for example, going back to the thing of paganism. Aside from human sacrifices, Gregory the Great, that also kind of sympathized mildly with the Franks in anti-Longobard function, denounced among the Franks still dendrolatric and zoolatric cults. That means that the Franks still worshipped trees and animals, while Christian. Still at this time, that we are basically between the end of the 6th and the beginning of the 7th century. And even half a century later, the situation probably wasn't that, 150 years later, things hadn't probably changed that much. If Carloman's Capitular in 742 was putting together a wide sample of uses and traditions that were basically pagan, right? This is important. This is the Carlmanni Principis Capitulare, number 5, in the Monumenta Germani Historica, chapter 1, page 25, if you're interested. You can't find that stuff. There was also this other practice that seems kind of strange, but there is this penances on payment. Basically a list of prices that you have to pay for according to everything you have committed. And the church applied this on a base of a degree of gravity of the various sins that is present in the Frankish church at this time, that it's actually very similar and in certain ways overlapping to the Wertgeld, that is the money, like the money composition of certain crimes according to the juridical and especially mental system of pagan origin that you can find. That is to say, in the German laws, you kill someone, you paid a certain amount of money, right? This is something that went on actually for a very long time, even up to. I made a video about this. I don't remember how it's called, like penitence. I don't remember, but it's extraordinary, similar to what the pagan money composition was about. You kill someone, you pay. So there's not much difference between the pagan and the Christian world in Francia, after all. Right? And this reflects, however, also probably a failure in the evolution of Frankish society. It's not as the Frankish world basically evolves under some civil, like society becomes more orderly, but it's mostly a private direction that starts controlling society rather than a strictly public one. So that's how the Franks progress, which makes it even darker because it makes you realize that in fact the Franks weren't quite aware of what the public authority was about still at this point. Like the monarchy ruled, and the Merovingians were the first examples of this, because the Merovingians believed that literally all the kingdom was their own private possession, and every Frank basically, regarding to his own goods, believed the same thing. So then you wonder why the Carolingian Empire collapsed, because still at that time, Franks didn't conceive the idea that there was a state you had to obey laws. Like, everything was still in this pagan contractualism for which, I fight, I must have back something. And this was fueled by the Frankish clienteles in Gaul, who were quite wealthy, quite powerful, and had been structuring during the Merovingian as well as Carolingian period, but no counter-alter to this of a more centralized direction had been formed. So Frankish society, in order to conclude this, is incredible because it has so many it's even hypocritical by a certain measure, because if you think about that, the Franks will become the heralds of the conversion of all the other Germans. I mean, think about the Saxons, think about how Christianity, the Carolingian Empire evangelized through also, of course, the British, the Irish missionaries and so on, but it was vehiculated by the Franks, and the Franks would become, the Roman Empire's most Christian one. But still they had a mindset that reflected completely different realities, and that's where you understand the big difference that existed in Frankish society between the elite and the commoners, like the freemen, or what had been left of them at one point, because in the Frankish world there is an ultra elite. Like how it would become eventually even further enhanced during the feudalism. Like, there are a very few people who own an enormous amount of wealth, while the majority of the population that doesn't own a great much. Elsewhere in Europe, the average person is faring better. Like, it's on average fairly wealthier, because the elites, though, are weaker, and therefore that's how the Carolingians win at the end of the day, because they have very well structured elites. They can afford the creation of this military clienteles, their professionalism, these immense resources which take to have a mounted heavy cavalry force that you can move every single year. Other kingdoms didn't have anything like that. Now, it will take a lot to evolve, but much of what, like the cast here, the mold is already present at this point. Now, the combination between Merovingian dynasty and the Gallo-Roman elites is the force. It's this incredible solution that from which everything will rise. So, okay, today I digressed a lot. We talked too much, but I thought it was still very important to stress these aspects, because it makes you understand so much, even especially about the military character of the Merovingian dynasty and their legitimization, even through a religious point of view. And we shouldn't be surprised also that the Carolingians used their own power in the way they did, in the name of God, because of this precedence, right? Okay, so let's stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like, or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.